Hey everyone, welcome back. Today I am going to be talking about my top tips for keeping my tomatoes healthy throughout the growing season. For background, I have 18 tomato plants. 10 are in 15-gallon grow bags, 8 are in 10-gallon grow bags. I have 14 different varieties, 17 of which are indeterminate, and 1 is a determinate tomato. Determinate tomatoes typically grow to 3 to 4 feet tall. They produce all of their tomatoes at one time and then they die off. The indeterminate tomatoes can grow 6, 7, 8 feet tall. They will keep growing until something kills them off, like weather or pests and disease. The first thing I want to cover today is supporting your tomato plants. Both types of tomatoes can benefit from some type of support. Typically that's a tomato cage or some type of like a vertical trellis just to hold up the plants so that they don't flop over. Particularly indeterminate tomatoes, because they grow so tall, their stems are quite flimsy and can't support the fruit. So you want to make sure that they are as upright as possible. This helps to ensure that there's air circulation for the plant. Also, it allows you to see the plant. So if there are pests attacking the plant, you can actually see them. If the plant is just flopping over itself, it would be difficult for you to actually determine if there are pests on the plant, and that would encourage more disease on the plant itself. Plus, if it's flopping over, you can risk breaking the stems of the plant and it won't be able to support the fruit properly. I use these 3-foot cages. The plant will continue growing well beyond the top of this cage, and then I will also utilize a 6-foot stake just to help keep the plant upright. The next thing I want to cover is watering. It's really important that you're on a consistent watering schedule when it comes to your entire garden. But when it comes to tomatoes, they benefit from 1 to 2 inches of water a week, and that includes the rain and anything that you're hand watering. Since I'm growing in bags, they dry out very fast. Raised beds dry out fast as well, but grow bags dry out faster than anything else. So on a hot day, especially here in central New Jersey, we have very hot summers. My bags are drying out within 24 hours, so I water in the morning and then I have to water again the following morning. On a really hot day, if we're like mid-90s plus, I might have to water twice. I might have to water once in the morning and then again once in the evening. Being inconsistent with your watering can affect the health of the plants. Overwatering is just as bad as underwatering a plant. Basically, you want your plant to be like a very wrung out sponge at all times. This might actually show up as disease on the fruit, such as like blossom end rot. Blossom end rot is when a fully formed fruit rots at the bottom. The best way to do this is just to come out every day and put your finger into the soil about like up to the second knuckle, just to see if the soil is moist. If the soil is dry about 2 inches down, then you want to give it some water. Always avoid overhead watering as much as possible and try to water at the base of the plant. When leaves stay wet for too long, especially in hot and humid conditions, it's a breeding ground for disease. So while we cannot control when it rains, we can control when we water our plants, and it's always best to just do it at the base of the plant. The next thing I want to cover is pruning, and pruning is a highly debated topic when it comes to tomatoes. To me, there are 2 types of prunings. There's the general pruning that you should do to maintain the health of your plant, and that you should do on all tomatoes. Then there is the pruning of the suckers. Now, when it comes to your general maintenance of your tomato plants, all plants will benefit from a little pruning. I'm referring to pruning the lower leaves of the tomato plant. Always use clean scissors and remove the lower leaves closest to the soil line to avoid soil splashing up on the leaves, which will promote disease on the plant. And in doing so, you allow air circulating in from the bottom, which also further prevents disease. Also, when you're growing indeterminate tomatoes, they're going to get very large. And if you're growing multiple plants in a relatively small space, especially like me, I'm a backyard gardener, so I'm using either raised beds or I'm using grow bags. If they are encroaching on their neighbor, for example, I might want to trim some of those branches back, just to ensure that there's always air circulation within all of the plants. When it comes to pruning the suckers, you do not want to prune a determinate tomato. Determinate tomatoes, as I mentioned, they grow over a very short period of time. They produce all their fruit at once and then they die back. A lot of the fruit is going to come off of the suckers. So by removing those suckers, you're basically removing fruit. So when it comes to a determinate variety, you want to do as little pruning as possible, just trim some of the lower branches for air circulation to prevent disease, and that's it. When it comes to indeterminate tomatoes, and this is where the debate really comes in, it's whether you should prune suckers or not. I do not prune my suckers. While I have a relatively long-ish growing season here in central New Jersey, I'm about 180 days from the start of the last frost to the end of the season, which is the first frost. So mid-April to about mid-October. So roughly 180 days. But I'm not growing my tomatoes for that whole 180-day period. They basically get started indoors. They come out somewhere between like mid-May to the end of May. They grow throughout the summer, and then they die back in like maybe September timeframe. I tend to leave several suckers on my tomato plant because a sucker is essentially a brand new tomato plant forming off of the main stem. So I want to get as many tomatoes as possible, so I leave my suckers. Now, by removing the suckers, you're just sending the energy to the fruit that is growing off of the main stem, and there's nothing wrong with that, especially in a shorter growing season where you want to redirect the energy to the flowers that are on the main stem and the fruit that is growing. But if you have a longer growing season like me, it doesn't hurt you to keep some of the suckers on and allow more fruit to form. What I do cut are some of the lateral branches below the first fruit set. So as my tomato plant grows, I'm going to remove a lot of the lateral branches on the lower third of the plant below the first fruit set. This will redirect the energy to the rest of the plant, including the suckers that I allow to remain and the fruit. This plant is still relatively small. It hasn't even reached the top of the cage yet. So I am going to leave these in place now because they need the leaves for photosynthesis. But as it gets taller, I will start to remove some of these lower lateral branches. The next thing I want to talk about are pests and disease. So pests and disease, especially when it's hot and it's humid, can affect any plant that you're growing in your garden. The best way to prevent pests and disease is to grow a healthy plant. When a plant is vulnerable, like in its seedling stage, for example, it's more vulnerable to pests and disease. And a plant that has been affected by disease is more likely to attract pests, and a plant that has been attacked by pests is more likely to attract disease. They just go hand in hand. So grow a healthy plant and you're going to have less of a risk of having pests and disease. And the way you grow a healthy plant is by some of the things I've mentioned here. Supporting them properly so that you have good air circulation, is standing upright. You can monitor the plant's health by going on a consistent watering schedule, by pruning the plant so that it gets really good air circulation. And something else I do is I apply kaolin clay to the leaf surface of my plants, both the top side and underside of the leaf. And it creates an inhospitable environment for pests. They don't want to land on the leaf surface. From a pest perspective, it seems to be working well, particularly on the cucumbers and squash. When I first planted my cucumbers and squash, within like the very next day of transplanting, they were covered in cucumber beetles. So I have since sprayed the leaves completely with the clay and I haven't had any problems so far. I also have some squash on a trellis behind me, and they are also sprayed, and that the rabbits are not eating the leaves of those plants. So I've also read that they will be less likely to chew the leaves. So far it's working, and this is my first year using it. I've read that it's really helpful. I've used other things in the past, but I wanted to use something that was a bit gentler, and this so far seems to be doing the trick. I use a sprayer to apply the clay to the full plant, both top and bottom of the leaf surface, but it does wash off very easily with a heavy rain. So you will need to reapply the clay after the rain. Recommendation is to do this early in the morning or in the evening when the sun isn't hitting the plant. On this side, the sun is already hitting them, so I'm gonna wait to apply it till later today. The one thing I didn't mention earlier is that the clay will reduce the temperature of the leaves by 5 to 10 degrees. So on a very hot day, this is super beneficial for your plant because it'll help to reduce heat stress. The last thing I want to cover today is getting on a fertilizer schedule for your plants. When I was growing my seedlings indoors, I started them on organic liquid fertilizer, and I was doing like a quarter strength, then a third, and then a half. So now that they're outdoors, I am doing a full strength liquid fertilizer every 7 to 10 days that I started about 2 weeks after transplant. I'm using full strength Neptune's tomato and veg. This is an organic fertilizer. It's gentle on the roots, it won't burn them, but it's providing the nitrogen that the plant needs to grow tall, promote that leafy growth on the plant. Once more of my plants are flowering, I'm going to switch over to a fertilizer that will provide more potassium and phosphorus for flower development and fruiting. Right now, a gallon is feeding about 3 of these plants in bags, but as the tomatoes grow larger, I'll be using more fertilizer for each plant. Never apply fertilizer to dry soil. Always wet the soil first, so give the plants a drink of water, let that soak in for about 30 minutes, then apply your fertilizer. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe to support my channel. I have a lot of great content coming out, including my end of June garden tour.